and there was a time when I did not, have you ever thought 8 generations into the future? Hello and welcome to the Durham Talents channel. My name is Jesse Durham, and today's subject will be a principle from R. Nelson Nash's work, Becoming Your Own Banker, and it's a cornerstone principle. It's going to be thinking long range. So welcome to the channel and the discussion today. Let me start by asking some questions. I like starting conversations with questions because it puts us in a pensive mode. It gets us to thinking. It starts opening up our brain waves to consider. And what I'll ask is, as of today, right now, what do you have in place financially? And that would be according to whatever your household or business or investing and your legacy ideas, what all that looks like for you. What do you have in place, set up today that would be carried out in your absence, in the event of your graduation, of you passing on? What's going to be carried out according to how you want things to be done? Now, let me also ask, what is the furthest that you have thought about anything? And I know I've already started asking questions about finances, but what is the furthest you've thought about anything that's important to you? Have you planned things for next year? Do you have things planned for after your retirement or when you get into passive income years? Have you made plans or preparations for entities or organizations that you care about, or perhaps your heirs or your children? What about grandchildren? And I can tell you that I remember where I was, and I believe what year that I heard for the first time someone mention that they were thinking 8 generations into the future. Now, I've grown up hearing in Scripture where it says a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. And I think that's fantastic. I've actually been able to witness where my grandfather had bought lands and was able to give those to his daughters that were married and different things. And I've heard stories about my great-grandfather and how he had land and different things. And, I've been able to see and witness how former generations have made plans and implemented this transfer of wealth or gifts or property to give that next generation a boost, a head start. And it's a beautiful thing. And again, I would point out that it's biblical. Myself, that's just my view. That's a lens that I look at things through. But I also recognize that when I heard a gentleman say for the first time that he was thinking 8 generations into the future, I at that time had not considered that. And over the years now, I've had a few more things click for me. Like where I live in this county, it seems to be, so far as I can tell so far, that my great-great-great-great, so 4 greats, great-great-great-great, grandfather has a tombstone, and I know where it's at, and I visited it and been to that location here in the same county where I live now. And of course, my wife and I, we have 3 children ourselves. So for several generations, we've been in this county. And the only thing, material at least, which is not everything, but it's something to come into the conversation in thinking long range. But materially, the only thing that I have connected to that name, that person, aside from the family name itself, is a tombstone that I can visit, which is more than some have and less than others have, and we'll talk about that. But from generation to generation, perhaps there's been a transfer of property or money or other valuables. And of course, we could get into other things like I think it's very valuable to consider what books we may leave behind to our children, what photos, of course, we may be leaving behind to our children. There are lots of valuable things, and you decide for you, and I'll decide for me. But in this conversation of considering Nash's principle of to apply and implement the infinite banking concept intergenerationally, we must think long range. We must be thinking, and he actually references that particular scripture of a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. It's from Proverbs. But what is the furthest, as of right now, that you've thought? And if I'm asking you a question that's making you think for the first time, like I thought for the first time about, oh, well, okay, what if I even looked past my children's children? What if I looked past grandchildren? What kind of impact could I have, maybe above and beyond a tombstone that they could visit and read my name and dates and such? What if we could do something now that would implement or that would impact future generations, even beyond our children's children? And you eat an elephant one bite at a time. Rome wasn't built in a day. The longest journey begins with one step. You see what I'm saying? There are things that we can implement today that can improve today, right now. You know, if you're vetting this idea of the infinite banking concept and you arrive at the conclusion, yes, I do want to become my own banker, and you know enough from having read Nelson's book and had a conversation, and you know you're in our process and we're talking about your specific situation because we don't have a cookie cutter approach. When you arrive at having enough information to begin, that will affect the here and now. It's about accounting for your need for finance today. Now, to do that, we have a long-range mindset. Because again, there are only two ways to be able to finance things. Either we borrow someone else's money and we pay them interest and they receive dividends and profits above and beyond the principal that they allow us to use, and it'll be on their terms and conditions, and we repay that back. And that's interest that forever leaves our household or our business. Or we amass capital, we put our money somewhere, don't touch it, don't use it, don't benefit from it. We lose EVA, the economic value that could have been added. So we have to accrue it somewhere. My question is where? We have to accrue it somewhere, and then we liquidate it. We spend it all for that thing that we were going to finance, which that's better than the first scenario, but all of that missed opportunity does not help us or our family. So for those of us that are thinking long range, the only thing better than A, paying others interest on their terms and conditions, or B, forfeiting the opportunity that we could be earning on our family income, helps us to arrive at C. What if we could finance the things that we're going to do anyway, and we could get that principal and interest back into a family-owned system on our terms and conditions, wherein there will eventually be a tax-free transfer of wealth. Now, I mention a tax-free transfer of wealth because a properly structured whole life policy with a mutual company that pays a dividend, the death benefit from such a policy is given to the beneficiaries tax-free. So again, going also back to that, where do we put money? You know, R. Nelson Nash in his second book called it the warehouse of wealth. It's got to have a home. It's got to have a base. It's got to have a hub. It's got to have a place where we bank it. If we just even look at the word banking, we're amassing, you know, blood banks, food banks, river banks. It's an amassing and accruing of the blood or food or sand on a riverbank, whatever the case may be. I would promote the idea that you can be your own banker, and that if you begin implementing a long-range thinking, a long-range approach to how you finance things, there's no telling what that could look like for your children's children and beyond, of course. Some other important questions that I would like to ask to provoke some thought about thinking long range and vetting or implementing the infinite banking concept would be, what is important to you now? And what do you foresee being important to you long range, regardless of whether you implement or don't implement, whether you apply or don't apply the ability that you have to practice the infinite banking concept? What is important to you? What will be important to you long range? And then subsequently and naturally, the question that would follow up would be, what could you do today then to impact that? Well, most organizations run on money. Business is business. Banking is a business. Everyone has a need for finance. Everything has a need for finance, meaning organizations or entities or churches or what have you, something that's important to you. And then, of course, your very own heirs, if you have heirs. But if there's something also that is important to you, well, some way right now and in the future, they probably have buildings or vehicles or staff or things that you could help in financing because of what you implement today. So it's the culmination of both. It's you being able to satisfy your need for finance today, but by doing so, and Nash describes this in his book, you'll end up with more death benefit than you were previously even underwritten for, because the growth of a policy and the highly respectable anticipation of dividends being received will grow a death benefit and will grow cash values, and that can be implemented in these organizations that we care about and would like to impact into perpetuity even. And in thinking about this, how we can make an impact in the organizations and the entities and the churches that we care about, for example, and future generations to be sure, has there been someone in your life that's left an impact there, or even something that you've read about? I've been on the phone just this week with a client who's told me on multiple occasions that a book they read when they were young inspired them. And this is someone who is single, who does not have children of their own. A very productive person, very productive, very proud of this client. And they've told me how they were impacted by a book that had an inspirational story about someone who had made excellent preparations in their lifetime. And at their passing, their impact was felt greatly by those that were cared about by that individual. So again, that's the beauty of permanent life insurance, especially permanent life insurance that's constructed and used in this way, is that perhaps there's nothing more noble than to be preparing for someone else, to be helping someone else, to be assisting someone else. And I believe that for all the parents out there, that we do probably have an inherent desire to have things better and make things better for our children. And if we'll just walk that out, we are obviously going to end up talking about future generations. And then, of course, we can spread that to include entities and churches and organizations that we care about deeply as well. When I mentioned my great-grandfather earlier, I've actually been told that he had something like 100 acres in a area not too far from where we live now. And we drive by there, beautiful area, gorgeous view of the mountains where we live here in western North Carolina. And obviously that was sold. Well, not obvious to you, but I'm telling you, it was sold over the years. And, the example that I had from my grandfather then, the next generation, the following generation, is that he himself procured different properties that he gave to his different daughters as they would get married and such, giving them property to be able to have a household on and whatnot. And I got to see that growing up by visiting aunts and uncles, and those were properties that had been given by my grandfather, and it's just it's a beautiful thing. Now, by the time that it got to my wife and I, after we graduated from college and got full-time jobs and were making our way in the married world, we ended up procuring property for ourselves, and we paid for that ourselves. We didn't end up receiving an inheritance. So I'm not bemoaning that. I'm simply saying that I was both inspired by seeing how my grandfather had done enough in his life to be able to impact his children, and that was a beautiful example for me. And even though that inheritance hasn't reached us, again, I'm not bemoaning anything. I had a beautiful childhood growing up. I did get to know my grandfather, and I did get to see and witness, his love for family and his preparation in getting properties for his children. And perhaps that will end up affecting grandchildren. We'll see. But for sure, I've thought about these sorts of things now that, okay, I've got a great-great-great-great-grandfather who the only material thing that I have left to even lay my eyes on is a tombstone with his name. And my great-grandfather, who allegedly had, 100 acres or so, he's got a small road named after him, which is pretty cool. But nothing there. That's someone else's now. My grandfather was able to get properties to each of his children, and that was a beautiful thing for me to be able to see. And again, I'm not bemoaning that none of that materially reached me. That's fine. I'm grateful for the experience and the influence that those things have had on me, but I am trying to point out that they were different. And I am trying to emphasize my own desire for that to be different in future generations, that I would like to be positioned well enough to be able to impact my children's children and far beyond, actually, and far beyond. And the best way that I know to do that is to account for my need for finance, to do as well as I can independently, autonomously, now, not be beholden to conventional lending systems, but be privately in our family capable, by building up a system of properly structured policies that we own, to account for our need for finance. And for us, that looks like I have a policy on me, we have a policy on my wife, we have a policy on each of our 3 children, and they are 8, just turned 8, 6, and 1. 8, 6, and 1. Each of them already have their first policy on them, and we have other policies. So we've been building a system of these policies over the past several years, so that right now we can account for our need of finance, and also to have all of our family members have protection. But again, Nash said, and I agree, that our need for finance is greater than our need of a death benefit, or greater than our need of protection. But both are worth accounting for, to be sure. So in building a system of policies that we can use for our need of finance today, just better and better positions ourselves in the here and now, because the policies become more efficient. The more we use the policies and play honest banker with ourselves, the better that it gets, this privatized banking system. Also, the policies in and of themselves continue to grow. The dividends buy more paid up additional insurance, which inherently means that we have higher cash values year after year, which is just more capital that we can access again to ultimately implement what our thinking and planning is intergenerationally for this long range purpose of impact and legacy that we want to have. Nash himself would say that being trained as a forester made him consider and look at things in 70-year time frames. Now, policies today, you can procure a 121-year policy today, but 70 years, in thinking about that, 70 years, because again, he was talking about forestry and trees and how to systematically go about lumbering forest land. 70 years is a long time. And in this society of instant gratification, instant results, instant everything, the reels, the microwaves, don't get me started. And I know I'm just as susceptible as anyone to go back into an instant gratification mindset. And I constantly have to check myself in thinking about the infinite part of the infinite banking concept. So thinking 70 years into the future is a good approach. And when we consider trees, as my wife and I have been recently, we have been enjoying fruits off of a fig tree that we planted just a couple of years ago, and it's already producing fruit now, and we've really enjoyed it through the summer and even into the fall. You know, the only regret I have about that fig tree is not having more of them and not having planted it sooner so it could be even bigger and yield even greater results. The best time to plant a tree is years ago, but the next best time is today. So suffice it to say, we'll be planting more fig trees into the future, and we'll be getting more policies as it makes sense again as well to keep adding to our privatized banking system for our family to satisfy our need of finance today and for generations into the future. I mean, just imagine if our children or our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren or any entity that we care about, any organization that we care about that we would like to impact into the future, even when we're gone, what would it look like if the next time that a vehicle was needed, we didn't have to submit ourselves to 2 years of paperwork scrutiny, donate a kidney, sign away our firstborn, terms and conditions, interest paid, all these other things? What if we just from our privatized family system procured the vehicle that we wanted? And we could talk about college, we could talk about honeymoons, we could talk about weddings, we could talk about properties, we could talk about, again, going back to the infinite part of the infinite banking concept, you know, the only limiting factor is our imagination. Nash said that. The only limiting factor is our imagination for how to implement the infinite banking concept. It's infinite what we can do. Now, in thinking about, and one of the biggest promptings that I had in considering having a discussion here on the channel about long-range thinking, and that as one of the cornerstone principles from Nash's book, Becoming Your Own Banker, was actually a vacation that my family, including one of my brothers, who's also a client, a vacation that we took to Vermont just a couple of years ago, but we still talk about that trip. And what it is we had gone to the Von Trapp family estate. Now, anybody that's seen The Sound of Music knows the family that I'm talking about, and we actually went to their family estate up in Vermont one summer a couple of years ago. Beautiful area, beautiful state, beautiful area, beautiful state. We had a grand time. And at the property, there's a restaurant where you can eat at the Von Trapp family restaurant, and they have condos, and then they have the old, I started to say homestead, which I'm sure it was that for them, but it's a grand property. It's beautifully located in the mountains, and it's just so well manicured, beautiful. It's just, it's a mixture, I suppose, of a cottage and a castle at the same time, seems like, in my memory. But we had a beautiful time, and we got to learn a little bit about the family history while we were there, and just walking the grounds. I mean, all the way down to, there was a family cemetery on site there where you could see generations of Von Trapps being memorialized and remembered there. And again, the estate was just kept in perpetuity. And what I'm saying is I know that's a little bit of popular culture coming out by mentioning a movie that many of us would know about, The Sound of Music, but there was a real family behind that story. And the real family behind that story still owns lands, still has a restaurant where folks can come and visit, because that was apparently a really big deal to them, that they would have visitors often, of course, and being so musically gifted and talented as they were, they would host and they would play music and just have a grand time year round, as it would seem. But the things that family had put in place still make it possible for families like mine to be able to come and visit and learn about them and enjoy their property and enjoy businesses that are, they had a wedding venue out in the beautiful fields and barns and just beautiful sight. They had so much there. And that family began that work decades and decades and decades ago. And it's still impacting other families today. And I just think that is a beautiful thing. And there are other families that we could talk about. But what I think is most important is your family. Me and my family, you and your family. What do you want to do? What do you want things to look like for yourselves here and now? Are you accounting for the banking function in your life? Who controls the banking function in your life? You don't have to abdicate that to someone else. You don't have to be beholden to conventional lending. What do you want things to look like for yourself? Do you appreciate the idea, the concept of independence and autonomy in your finances? And what would you like that to look like for your children, for your grandchildren? Can you think 8 generations into the future? I hope you can. It's an encouraging thought, I feel like, that for sure, certainly, we can do something today that will be better for us, but that will also impact our future generations. So just remember that the time goes by either way. When you've gotten to the point of vetting this idea, the time's going to go by either way. Look at it in this light. Either we live. Aren't we better off if we're accounting for our need for finance for ourselves on our terms and conditions with our capital, not locking our way or putting our money away where we can't touch it without fees and penalties and etc.? Aren't we better off practicing that idea for ourselves now? Absolutely. And at the time of our graduation, at the time of our passing on, won't we be better off for those that we care about if we've set up that tax-free transfer of wealth as well? Yes. Okay, so learn, study, get your questions answered. And of course, I'm always open to a conversation, but figure out what you want things to look like for your family. Let's have a conversation about how to implement a privatized system for your family or your business or your investing so that you can realize these desires that you have for as big as you can stretch your imagination. So the time's going to go by either way. Remember the tree. The best time to have planted a tree was years and years ago. The next best time is today. So study, learn, ask your questions, find out what you need to implement this idea. For those of you that are clients, I appreciate you tuning in and investing in your education, spending time in your education. Remember, now Nelson Nash also encourages us to always rethink our thinking. So thanks for being open to letting iron sharpen iron. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can call me at 828-817-4223, or you can email durhamtalents@gmail.com. This has been a great pleasure for me. I look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day. Take care. Can you remember being 10 years old and thinking how mature, how grown up a 20-year-old was? How about, can you remember being a 20-year-old looking at a 40-year-old, 50-year-old, and just how mature, maybe even how old they were? Well, could you imagine being 40, 50, 60, 70? Fill in any number that you want. Time goes by either way. The question is will we or will we not be better off whether we live or whether we graduate by implementing the infinite banking idea into our family and our business? I have 2 sons and a daughter. So for myself, 8 generations in the opposite direction, going back up the family tree. The only thing that I've been able to get to so far is a tombstone. And that's great. We have a family name. There's a tombstone that we can visit. That's a beautiful thing to be able to do and show my children. But what about in the opposite direction? What about into the future? Can we think long range enough today to be able to impact 8 more generations into the future? Let's talk about it.